All right, here we go. What a joy to be with you again. You light up my eyes and light up my life. It's a great joy to be with you. Celebrating the privilege of Moses' gospel. Who would have thought of that? How should Israelites feel about the gospel? Well, I used to feel sorry for them. When I was where you are sitting, I was still feeling sorry for them. How odd of God to choose the Jews to saddle them with his law, which they couldn't keep, and in which there was no joy in keeping it to the extent that you could. I used to feel sorry for them because I thought their role in life was a heavy, heavy cross to carry. I don't feel that way anymore. In fact, I hope you, by now you sense that I feel quite different after living with Moses for 25 years. I see the smile in Moses' faces in different places, and when I read this book, I see the cartoons he is drawing, the very interesting caricatures that are really funny when you get right down to it. And I see his sympathy and sensitivity. You know, you're supposed to go to the central sanctuary 3 times a year for the annual festivals. You're supposed to. No, you don't. You're not supposed to. You get to. You get to go to the central sanctuary 3 times a year with all Israel. You can celebrate there in the presence of God. And the point of the 3 central festivals was to keep the story alive. They're tied to Israel's story of redemption, covenant, and land. But then you say, that was a great week we had together, and we ate in the presence of the Lord, and you get home to the real world, and you say, in this real world, I'd like to eat meat. Because there are laws that says that if you want to eat meat, you go to the central sanctuary, and there you can eat meat all you want, because bring the offerings, and the Lord as the divine host says, sit down and I'll serve you. That's the picture. But what happens if you want to eat meat at home? Moses asks this question in chapter 12. He's just talked about that central sanctuary where you banquet in the presence of the Lord, and you came home and you say, I'd like to eat meat as much as I want. Why can't I? And Moses says, go ahead. You want to eat meat? Have it. Enjoy. Just with every privilege there always comes a rider. The privilege is you get to eat meat at home, but when you prepare this, remember, he uses the word, you may butcher, the word is sacrifice, zabach. So that in effect, every slaughter for food is a sacrifice. On the other hand, you may freely slaughter your lamb and your beef and your goat and the antelope and the deer out there. Go ahead, eat. Just be sure that it is kosher food and that it is prepared kosherly. That is, the blood is drained. No roadkill. That you can sell to your neighbors. That is interesting. In chapter 14, he says, go ahead, sell that to your neighbors, give it to your neighbors, but you're a holy people. So that the blood, you need to sanctify the blood or recognize the sanctity of blood. And so they have this request, I'd like to eat meat. And I used to think that Moses said, stop it, be satisfied with what you have. But instead the Lord says, fine, we can do that. But what if you live so far away from the sanctuary that you can't take that firstborn as your sacrifice all the way down to the central sanctuary? That's a 3-day walk. If you live up at the base of Mount Hermon, that's a 3-day walk, and you're carrying this kid or this lamb or whatever. Go ahead, instead of taking that lamb, put some silver in your pocket, and then when you get there, then you can buy a lamb and do that. always facilitating. Late in chapter 17, hey, when you've rested in the land and you say, I'd like to have a king over myself. What does Moses say? Go ahead, get yourself a king. Just be sure he's the one that the Lord chooses. He's not an alien. He's from among your own country people. And then he has some regulations. This king may not multiply for himself women and silver and gold and horses. That's the Canaanite definition of kingship. But he shall create for himself a copy of this Torah and read it all the day of his life. But if you want a king, there's nothing wrong with having a king. In fact, we know the king was in God's mind from the beginning, because he had told Abraham and Sarah, kings will come from you. And we've had hints. Judah, Genesis 49, the scepter shall not depart from Judah. So that when the Lord tells Samuel to anoint Saul, if I had been Samuel, I'd have said, you can't do that. Saul is a Benjaminite. He's not from Judah. I find it curious that Samuel didn't protest, but he said, the people said, give us a king like the nations. And God says, fine, I can get you a king like the nations. and he gives them a Benjaminite. And you know all about the Benjaminites from the book of Judges. They are Sodom and Gomorrah revisited. And that's the king he gives them. That's what you want. Nothing wrong with having a king, but it's got to be the one the Lord has in mind. And if your motives are otherwise. Well, in any case, I don't feel sorry for them anymore. Our last study will look at two texts that frame Moses' forward-looking valedictory addresses in Deuteronomy 4:1-8 and 33 1-5 and 26-29. The first introduces the sermonic part of his first address, and the last frames his blessing of the 12 tribes, and it ends with the last words in Scripture we hear from the lips of Moses. And we need to have those words ringing in our ears when we leave this place today, because they are fabulous gospel words. Well, now let's put into context these two texts. The first one comes from near the end of the first address. This is chapter 4, verses 1-8. It's a short little text. And the second one comes from the frame of the blessings at the end of the book. Chapter 33, he blesses the tribes, but it begins with a very poetic introit, and it ends with a very poetic, shall we say, epilogue, but that's too prosaic, extroit at the end of it, a postscript. Fabulous poetry of the highest level. And that's what we're going to do. One is a prose text and the other is a poetic text. And hopefully when we leave in an hour or so, then we will have both the song and the scripture ringing in our ears. So let's begin by talking about the privilege of being a Torah people. That's an oxymoron. It used to be in my head, not anymore. But when you translate Torah as instruction, revelation, communication, everything changes. It's not just being a law people. And as we will see, having law is good. The people who have no laws are the most pathetic people on earth, because they don't know the boundaries. But here, the privilege of being a Torah people. So here's the text from Deuteronomy 4:1-8. So now, O Israel, listen. This is not legalese. Moses is a speaker, and he begins his addresses and sections of his addresses with what we call the Shema. Shema is the imperative form of hear. Hear, O Israel. Listen to the ordinances and stipulations I'm teaching you by putting them into practice, that you may live and enter and possess the land that Yahweh, the God of your fathers, is giving you. You may not add to the word that I command you, and you may not subtract from it. You are to keep the commands of Yahweh your God that I am charging you to keep. So your own eyes saw what Yahweh did at Baal Peor, that every person who went after the Baal of Peor, Yahweh destroyed from among you. But you who held fast to Yahweh your God, all of you are still alive today. In the Torah, there is life. Look, I have taught you the ordinances and stipulations just as Yahweh my God commanded me, that you may put them into practice within the land you are entering to possess. So keep them. That is your obligation and your duty, and this is the burden that I have laid on you. No, that's how I would have written it if I had composed this 20 years ago. That's how I interpreted it. No, keep them, that is, put them into practice, for this is the mark of your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations, who will hear these ordinances and say, wow, what a pathetic people. What a miserable lot. No, it's the opposite. Wow, this great nation is indeed a wise and understanding people. Look. Which other great nation is there that has a God as near to it as Yahweh our God is to us whenever we call upon him? Do you know another great nation that has a God that answers prayer? He has no ears, but he hears. What a privilege. And then second, and which other great nation is there that has righteous ordinances and stipulations as this whole Torah package that I am presenting to you today? This is one fabulous text. But before we get into it, let's set the context. This is the 4th chapter of Moses' first address. There are 4 chapters in this first one. It's relatively short. In chapters 1, 2, and 3, he has been talking about the past. He has been reviewing what has been our experience since we left Sinai to when we got here, where we're situated. So he has historical recollections of past divine grace and human response. He begins with recollections of the Exodus generation's journey from Sinai to the plains of Moab. That's 1:6 to 2:1. Remember, this is the Exodus generation. The ones that came out of Egypt, they got as far as Kadesh Barnea. And it didn't take them long to get there. Under 2 years from when they left Egypt, they were there. So this is that generation. Second, Moses' recollections of Yahweh's grace to the conquest generation. At the end of chapter 1, he sends them back into the desert. Go die there. You don't want to find life in the land? Die in the desert. And the point of the 40 years was to get rid of that generation and to replace it with a new one. Have you ever imagined what that sound of Israel's camp for 40 years must have been like? What was the dominant sound? Remember when they left Egypt? What did they hear all over Egypt as the Israelites marched out? It's the death wail in every Egyptian household where the oldest son was taken. That's what they heard all over Egypt. But they were spared. Now, in this place, do the math. I'm not sure about how to interpret the numbers. I actually think that the number translated regularly as thousands, 608,000 men, 20 years and older came. I have a feeling that at that point we need to interpret the word thousand as another meaning of that word, which means clan or head of a clan. And then you come to much more understandable and reason. It's doubtful that the population of Egypt was ever in the millions in those ancient history centuries. But if you have 608 clans, each of which could contribute to the fighting force a certain number, The numbers all make perfect sense. There's still lots of people here. They're in the thousands and thousands and thousands. It's still a big job for the Lord to take care of them. But in any case, this is the conquest generation that crosses into the Jordan, across the Jordan, and Moses is talking to them, 2:2 to 3:29. And then we have pastoral reflections on past divine grace and anticipation of future grace. This is chapter 4, verses 1 to 40. He changes gears in 4 verse 1. And now, Israel, in light of all that you've experienced, as we look forward, what should we think? What should we remember? How then should we live? And our text is... I'm not giving you my points here. Our text is a summary of this future-looking admonition, shall we say, hortation. We don't use that word much. We use exhortation, but never hortation. We use hortatory, but never exhortatory. I know that because I just submitted an essay for publication in which the topic I was assigned was hortatory speech in the Pentateuch. And so I've just been, my head is full of that sort of stuff. But in chapter 4, verse 1, he shifts gears from remembering the past to preaching. Watch yourself. A half a dozen times he said, take heed to yourself, to use Paul's words, and to your doctrine. Take heed to yourself, watch yourself. But what's happened to this point is he's been retracing their steps from Sinai, that's where they began, chapter 1, and then they moved on as far as Kadesh Barnea, and they refused to enter the land, and they went back into the wilderness of Paran. And now when you get to where Moses is, we're at the top of that, at the top of the Dead Sea, on the right-hand side of the Jordan River. That's where he is talking to the people who survived all of that. That sets the stage then for chapter 4. Now, in chapter 4, this one divides into 3 parts as well. You have first, verses 1 to 8, the grace of Torah. Verses 9 to 31, the grace of covenant. And then 32 to 40, we talked about the second session, the grace of salvation. They're in the reverse order of the way they happened. They got out of Egypt first, and then they went to Sinai, and then they received the Torah. That's the last. But here, I think he does this deliberately so that he ends this sermon and sends the people home to their beds that evening with the brilliant gospel song on their lips. That's what they're celebrating as they go back to their tents for the night. That's my imagination. But in any case, that sets us up for the text that we have in front of us. Deuteronomy 4, 1 to 8. This is the grace of Torah. Well, what have we got here? The incredible grace. The paragraph opens with Ata and now, and then he adds, the goal of Torah is life and flourishing in the land. We've seen this formula before several times. We don't need to talk about it. But not all of these elements are here, but you've got the skeleton. The point is hearing that you may live and flourish. That's where we're headed. So that's the goal of Torah, life and flourishing in the land. The normative status of Torah, verse 2. This is an interesting verse. Notice, you may not add to the word that I command you, and you may not subtract from it. You are to keep the commands of Yahweh your God that I am charging you to keep. What's the point of that? Have you heard that before anywhere in the Bible? There's one other place. Revelation. The Bible ends with, cursed is anyone who adds to this text or subtracts from it. This is an ancient Near Eastern pattern of guaranteeing the integrity of a document. Now at this moment, Moses is speaking orally. And so to receive the word is to hear it and digest it and live it. To add to it is to, in addition to what Moses said, add your own ideas. And subtracting for it is, well, there are some things that Moses said I don't want. I'd rather live without. And so we tend to treat the scriptures like old country buffet, where you can go to the counters of food and you pick and choose that which you want to eat. And usually it's the unhealthy stuff, and it's not the stuff you actually need. It's the high sugar and high salt stuff. That's not helpful. This is a text that guarantees the integrity of the Torah that Moses is preaching. Moses is very clear about the canonical status of what he's doing and its inspired status. It's interesting, this expression is never used of the Decalogue. Don't add or subtract to the Decalogue. In fact, when Moses quotes it in chapter 5, he adds and subtracts. It's never said of that book of the covenant, chapter 21 to 23, that they read just before they sign, seal, and deliver the covenant at Mount Sinai with that blood ritual in the altar and on the people. You never see it in the instructions on holiness. It's not there. It's as if those documents, the Lord leaves it open for additional revelation to come. But with reference to the Torah of Moses in Deuteronomy, this is the only place in the First Testament where it applies to what Moses is doing. Or anybody else for that matter, except King Agur in Proverbs chapter 30, this non-Israelite, he talks about all the words that the Lord has said you shall not add or subtract to it. That's the only place. Elsewhere in the First Testament do you find it, and it's not until you get to the end of the New Testament it resurfaces. But this is everywhere in the ancient world. Texts. It's a big problem in the ancient world. People will come, they'll find a text, an inscription praising the king for whatever accomplishments. They'll come and they'll chisel out the king's name and put in their own. It's a huge problem all over the world. Here is the Hittite disposition toward it. This is a quotation. Of a covenant document. A duplicate of this tablet is deposited before the sun goddess of Arinna, since the sun goddess of Arinna governs kingship and queenship, and in the land of Mitanni, a duplicate is deposited before the storm god, lord of Kurina in Kachat. Whoever before the storm god, lord of the Kurina of Kachat, alters this tablet or sets it in a secret location, if he breaks it, if he changes the words of the text of the tablet, in regard to this treaty, we have summoned the gods of the secrets and the gods who are guarantors of the oath. They shall stand and listen to be his witnesses, and woe to anybody who tries to tamper with it. So that's what's happening here. This is normative Torah. All that Moses says is divine truth, and only that which Moses says is divine truth, canonical. It's setting the boundaries of what here. Here's the Idrimi statue, which I'm working on in a present project, and here, his whole skirt is filled with an inscription on it, and including one on his cheek. But at the end of the inscription, there is a curse. Anyone who might remove the statue of mine, may the heavens curse him. May the underworld gather up his offspring. May the gods of the heavens and the other world measure out his kingship and his land for him. As for anyone who might alter it so that it is effaced, may the storm god, the Lord of the heavens and the underworld, and the great gods make his name and his seed disappear from his land. And of course, that's a curse we find in the scriptures quite often, actually, since chapter 38 and Leviticus 26. The worst fate anybody can experience is, may your name be forgotten and your seed perish. The assumption is that people live on in their children. When a child is born, it's not a new life. It's an extension of the life of the parents, which is why when Jephthah sacrifices his daughter, he says, "Oy vey, you've brought me great trouble." Because the narrator says she was his only child, he had no other. When he sacrifices his daughter, he sacrifices himself. You're dead. The branch is cut off from this family tree. Well, that's the normative. Let's go to the life-sustaining function of the Torah. You always thought that the Torah kills, but let's look at this. Obedience to the Torah is the key to life. Your own eyes saw what Yahweh did at Baal Peor, that every person who went after the Baal of Peor, Yahweh destroyed from among you. But you who held fast to Yahweh your God. Remember, we read that this morning. Only him you shall serve. Only in his name you shall swear. Only by him you shall live. Well, only him you shall praise. You who held fast to Yahweh your God, you are alive today. Moses at this point expresses a higher respect for this generation of kids than the one that came out of Egypt. They're gone. They're either buried in the desert, and the faithless ones among this lot, and there still were some, at Baal of Peor, they got filtered out. And they're gone. So they are alive today because they remained true to the Torah. And of course, the background to this is Numbers chapter 25, verses 1 to 6. Well, and then we have in verse 5 the ethical and spiritual significance of the Torah. Look, I have taught you ordinances and stipulations just as Yahweh my God commanded you, that you may put them into practice within the land you are entering to possess. He's looking forward. This is life in the promised land. We are going to be abandoning our tents and replacing them with buildings. We're living houses that we didn't build and taking the harvest of olive groves that we didn't plant and whatever else. And then in verses 6 to 8, we have the climax, the privilege of being a Torah people. Look, I have taught you ordinances and statutes. I have taught you ordinances. Something's not going right here. I've taught you ordinances and stipulations just as Yahweh my God commanded you, that you may put them into practice within the land you are entering to possess. So keep them, that is, put them into practice. For this is the mark of your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations, who will hear these ordinances and say, wow, this great nation is indeed a wise and understanding people. A people with wise ordinances is a wise people. This is a privilege. This is not a sign of your low status. It's a sign of your elevated status. And then he adds, look, to which other great nation is it that has a God as near to it as the Lord whenever we call upon him? And which great nation is there that has righteous ordinances? They've all got ordinances, but they're man-made. And they don't have a quality of righteousness that applies to this one. And the stipulations, like this whole Torah that I am presenting you today. This is Israel's privilege. Now, I've said before, I used to feel sorry for the Israelites, and I thought, of all the people on earth, they were the least privileged because they were forced to keep the law of God. He rescued them from Egypt, yes, but then he brought them to himself and he dumped on their shoulders a package that's impossible. Well, how are we going to think about that? There are a couple of ways we can look at this text. We can look at this text from the perspective of the New Testament, and Paul particularly say this is a sorry lot. Or we can ask ourselves, notice about whom he's talking. Who is talking? What are, here. Look, Here. So keep them. Put them into. So this is for which, in the eyes of the nations, who will hear of these ordinances, and they will say, this great nation is wise and understanding people. Whose perspective is he talking about? It's the people out there. This is how the pagan world looks at Israel and say, how in the world did you get that? How can we have that? That's exactly what we all need. So now, in order to understand this, I would like for us to hear how the ancients talked about the problems they faced in their relationship to their gods. And so I'm going to read for you a very boring and long prayer to every god. I must read it, the whole thing, so that you start to feel the way the author of this thing felt. Feel the passion. He begins, may the fury of my Lord's heart be quieted toward me. May the God who is not known be quieted toward me. May the goddess who is not known be quieted toward me. May the God whom I know or do not know be quieted toward me. May the goddess whom I know or do not know be quieted toward me. May the heart of my God be quieted toward me. May the heart of my goddess be quieted toward me. May my God and goddess be quieted toward me. May the God who has become angry with me be quieted toward me. May the goddess who has become angry with me be quieted toward me. In ignorance I've eaten that forbidden of my God. In ignorance I've set foot on that prohibited by my goddess. O Lord, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. O my God, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. O my goddess, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. O God, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are many. O goddess, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. The transgressions that I have committed, indeed, I don't know. The sin that I have done, I do not know. The forbidden thing that I have eaten, I do not know. The prohibited place on which I have set foot, I do not know. Although I am constantly looking for help, no one takes me by the hand. O goddess, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are many, great are my sins. The transgressions that I have committed, I don't know. The sin which I have done, I do not know. The forbidden thing I've eaten, I do not know. The prohibited place on which I've set foot, I don't know. But the Lord in the anger of his heart looked at me. The God in the rage of his heart confronted me. When the goddess was angry with me, she made me become ill. The God whom I know or do not know has oppressed me. The goddess whom I know or do not know has placed suffering on me. How long, O my goddess, whom I know or do not know, ere your hostile heart is quieted? Man is dumb. He knows nothing. Mankind, everyone that exists, what does he know? Whether he's committing sin or doing good, he doesn't even know. O my Lord, do not cast your servant down. He is plunged into the waters of a swamp. Take him by the hand. The sin that I have done, turn into goodness. O goddess, whom I know or do not know, my transgressions are 7 times 7. Remove my transgressions, and I will sing your praise. May your heart, like the heart of a real mother, be quieted toward me. Like a real mother and a real father, may it be quieted toward me. And by the time you get to the end, you say, whoa, it's hard to keep back the tears. How sad, what a problem. But what's the problem? There are 3 problems here. Number 1, oh my God, whom I know or do not know. What do they know? They know the gods are angry. But they have no clue which God they need to placate. That's sad. Second problem. The sin that I have committed, I don't even know. Did I step on something? Maybe a sacred bug? Or a place that you had designated as sacred to you and I need to sanctify it? I don't know. How would I know? Or did I eat something? In the ancient world, dietary expectations by the gods that's a common idea. So that when we get to chapter 14 in Deuteronomy, where you've got this banqueting in the presence of the Lord with all the clean and unclean stuff, you should celebrate when you read that, because this Israelite knows where the boundaries are. It's perfectly at home in that world. And what's the third problem? They don't know the God that's been offended. They don't know what the offense is, and they don't know what it will take to fix it. I crawl before you. I beg. But nobody's listening. No one takes me by the hand. Nothing works. It's a horrible state to be in. And this is the default in our world today. The evidence of sin are everywhere. The violence, the oppression, the darkness, the mental illness of our young people these days. I mean, it's everywhere. And we search for answers, but nobody answers. We pour money into the system. Education will fix it. Employment will fix it. No, it won't. It's all in the wrong place. Well, let's reflect on Israel's privileged position. Now you understand verses 1 to 4. Wow! What a great nation this is, that has a God that hears when they pray, and that has given them a Torah as righteous as this whole Torah that I am presenting to you. Here are the answers the Israelites have. 1, the offended God has introduced himself by name, Yahweh, and committed himself to being their God. I am Yahweh your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the slave house. By name, he introduces himself. And the point of all the signs and wonders is that you might know that I am Yahweh. And then when Moses is on the mountain and he says, show me your glory. Moses never has enough of God's glory, does he? Show me your glory. And God says, fine, go in the cleft of the rock there and hide your face, cover your face, and I'll let my glory pass by you. I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy. But that's not what he was asking for. But God passes by and he hears the sound from heaven. Yahweh, Yahweh, gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in chesed and faithfulness, who forgives every kind of sin, but will not leave the guilty unpunished. It's an amazing revelation. They know their God. Jonah, we preached Jonah 2 weeks ago at the last chapter. What's wrong with God? That's the title of the sermon for chapter 4. Jonah said, I knew this would happen because I knew that you're gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness, and you relent concerning calamity with which you threaten Assyrians. And that's what's wrong with God. He's a gracious one. Well, this is privilege number 1. Privilege number 2. Their God has revealed in detail what the standards of right and wrong are. And I've said quickly in passing before, the more detail, the greater the grace. Did you hear that? The more detail, the greater the grace. the less is left up to chance and guesswork and experimentation. He gave them a way of the problem of sin. And this is C, that God has revealed in detail what it takes to solve the problem of sin. And if the Israelites come with their hearts that are penitent and confessing their sin and lives that are in tune and in touch with God, if they come and they bring their offerings as God in His mercy has invited them to, it'll work. And they will be forgiven. They know they will be forgiven. My sins are blotted out, I know. And the Israelites knew that. I did mention the other day the instructions on all the sacrifices in Leviticus 4, 5, and 6, 9 of them, different ones. And at the end of every one, there's the announcement. Thus the priest will make atonement for their sin, and they will be forgiven. And David, after his horrible thing with Bathsheba, he says in 51, "Be gracious to me, O Lord, according to your loving kindness, according to the greatness of your compassion, blot out my transgressions." That's 51. But then go to 32, which chronologically is after. "How privileged is the one whose sin is forgiven, whose transgression is covered." That's what the Israelites had. Oh, it's not the blood of this bull and this goat that takes away sin. But this blood and this bull, this blood of this goat or this bull, is the switch that God provided for them to access the eternal grace made possible in the sacrifice of Christ. They didn't know all of those details that we know from this side of the cross, but they had the Word of God. God said, "I will forgive." And when God promises forgiveness, He does. How privileged they were. Don't feel sorry for the Israelites anymore. This is the ultimate privilege, knowing the will of God. And now we could read again Psalm 19, 7 to 14. We would if we had time. But you can go home and read that. Celebrate with the psalmist. How I love your Torah, O Lord. All right, that's the text at the front end. Now we hurry on to the text at the back end. We've taken care of the privilege of Torah. Now we go to the end of the book, the end of Moses' utterances, and here he is equally eloquent, in fact, poetically eloquent, as he gives us a brand new picture of the privilege of being gospel people. The privilege of being Torah people and the privilege of being gospel people. By now you know that Torah people are gospel people. Torah doesn't mean law. It means the story. It starts with the story. It starts with the celebration. And then we respond in keeping with a gracious revelation of God. So let's go right to the end. Chapter 33. I've never heard anybody preach on this text. I'm sure you haven't either. It's a tough one in the Hebrew, but it's such a thrilling one. The end is at hand. Moses has just taught them the national anthem in chapter 32. From verse 1 all the way through verse 32 in our English, 43 verses of Israel's national anthem, telling their history in advance in poetic form. And this is what they are to sing whenever they gather, and it is to be, you are what you sing. That's the theology of that chapter. You are what you sing. But he has just finished. That very day, Yahweh spoke to Moses, get up, that's when he had finished teaching them the song, go up this mountain of the Abarim, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, opposite Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel for a possession, and die on the mountain which you go up. That's the only person in the Bible who is commanded to die. It's the imperative. Moses, go up and die. I'm sure there was still a tug in his heart. Yes, I'm going, but I would so have liked to cross the Jordan River. I mean, it's been there. Go die as Aaron your brother died at Mount Hor and was gathered to his people. Because you broke faith with me in the midst of the people of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh in the wilderness of Chin, and because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel. God won't let Moses get by with his own excuse. He says it's the people's fault. It's your fault I couldn't cross the Jordan. And God says, no, it's not. It's your fault. What happened at Meribah Kadesh, remember? You were not behaving yourself. Indeed, you may see the land before you, but you may not go there, into the land that I am giving to the people of Israel. You're not crossing the Jordan River. Well, what follows in this chapter, the bulk of this chapter then, is the blessing of the 12 tribes. You have that narrative preamble in verse 1, the hymnic exordium in verses 2 to 5, and then the hymnic coda at the end. And we're going to settle down on those two parts. The exordium at the front end and the coda, celebration, at the back end. But this is how the chapter starts. This is the blessing that Moses, the man of God, blessed the Israelites before his death. I love that introduction. I mean, we've had a troubled history with Moses by now, haven't we? But who's talking here? Who says this? It's the narrator. The narrator. He will have lots of more gushy things to say about him in chapter 34. Despite what Moses was saying about himself in chapters 1, 2, and 3. But by now, the narrator is giving him the last words. And he's expressing his deep, deep respect for this man, Moses, the man of God. He blessed the last words are blessings, and we expect to hear the last words from Moses' mouth to be cursed, don't we? No, it's blessing. And so he blesses all of these tribes. But before he begins, here's his preamble. He said, Yahweh came from Sinai and dawned upon them from Seir. He beamed forth from Mount Paran, and with him were tens of thousands of holy ones, with fire emanating from his right. O you who love the peoples, all his holy ones were in your hand. So they followed in your steps, receiving direction from you. When Moses commissioned us with the Torah, oh, really? Why does he bring that in here? As a possession for the assembly of Jacob. Thus he, Yahweh, became king in Jeshurun when the heads of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel together. I wish we had time to pick this apart, word by word, phrase by phrase. But let's do just a few quick details. Come. Notice, God is the mighty warrior coming from Sinai, coming from Seir, and then he beams all the way through the mountain of Paran. This is the Sinai desert. And with him, 10,000s of holy ones with fire emanating from his right. These are the heavenly courtiers. He's imagining God is accompanied by all the courtiers of heaven marching forth from Sinai. And it's a fiery, where there's fire, there's God. He has come from Sinai with them. But what else is happening here? And then in verse 3, he changes his attack, or his tack, actually. O you who love the peoples, all his holy ones were in your hand. So they followed in your steps, receiving direction from you. Whom is he talking about now? He uses the same expression, all his holy ones. In that first verse, it was the angelic heavenly beings. Who are they here? They're the Israelites. They're his people. They followed in your steps. They were God's earthly entourage, marching forward with the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And in the meantime, Moses commissioned us. This seems like a parenthetical comment, but he ties the giving of the Torah with the revelation and the presence of God. This was a part of this grand picture of the heavenly king marching forward with the people as they came to where they are now. He became king in Jeshurun. Do you know that word? Jeshurun. It's a passive word. It means somebody who has been straightened out. Well, what does that mean? We tend to think that this means that Israel is a righteous people. Morally, they're different from the nations. But we know from earlier chapters 8, 9, and 10, we know that they're not, as far as Moses is concerned, you're the most rebellious people I've ever seen. So it doesn't actually work there. Well, what then does it mean? Jeshurun. This is, I think it's a physical metaphor for Israel's salvation from slavery. Where shall we go? I'm jumping over this very quickly. I saw it here. When Moses commissioned us with the Torah, he became king in Jeshurun. It means straightened up, the straightened up ones. When did this happen? And now I'm going to skip way forward here to get you to the page where I am. Here we go. He became king in Jeshurun. The ones straightened by Yahweh. This name appears only 4 times in Scripture. Here, 32:15, 33 verse 26 again at the end, and Isaiah 44:2. Only 4 times in Scripture. But along with other titles, the beloved of Yahweh and all the rest that we have here, its significance is illustrated in 2 texts, Ezekiel 34:27 and Leviticus 26:13. I love these passages because they remind us of what is happening here. This is Ezekiel 34:27 when he looks to I will establish a covenant of peace with you, Ezekiel 34. And the trees of the field will yield their fruit. The earth shall yield its increase. They shall be secure in the land. They shall know that I am Yahweh when I break the bars of their yoke and deliver them from the hand of those who enslave them. Oh, really? That's the metaphor. This is a metaphor for Israel's salvation from the slavery of Egypt. Jeshurun, my straightened ones, you're walking upright. Let's go back. Where does Ezekiel get this idea? He's been having his devotions in Leviticus 26:13. I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt that you should not be slaves, and I have broken the bars of your yoke and made you walk upright. It's another brilliant gospel metaphor. And of course, you have echoes of this in the New Testament. About the yoke, Jesus says, take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. You have it there as well. We who are bound by, who are enslaved to sin, can't walk upright. What we need is a Savior who will take the yoke from our backs and deliver us. At Sinai, Yahweh formally became Israel's king, and Israel formally became his people. Yahweh had taken them out of Egypt that he might be their God. They might be his people. On the plains of Moab, this generation has been formally adopted as Yahweh's sons, and now they have a new name. Our oldest son, I've mentioned this before, our oldest child, a son, is His name is Jason. He wasn't born with that. A symbolic moment happened when we, in the official documents, changed his name. Those who are the suzerains have the authority to re-identify the people they're in relationship with. A new identity. And that's what they have. Jeshurun gives Israel a new identity. At the moment of adoption and covenant, Yahweh gives his son a new name. Well, this is the kingship of God, which is an important theme in the whole Pentateuch, and I wish we had time to review this, but I have to hurry on. I can send you these slides as a PDF when we're all done, and then you can have some of these additional notes. But let me get very quickly to the end of the coda of the blessing of Moses, and we have to make this, be satisfied with quickly going through this. The coda of Moses, after he has blessed the last one of the tribes, here's what he says. There is none like God, O Jeshurun, who rides through the heavens to your help. Through the skies in his majesty, the eternal God is your dwelling place, and underneath are the arms of the eternal one. And he thrust out the enemy before you and said, destroy. And then on the right-hand side of that screen, if you can read it from where you are, I jump to verse 29. But I skip the fulcrum. So Israel lives in safety. Jacob lives alone, secure, in a land of grain and wine whose heavens drop down dew. That's verse 26. And then he comes back. How privileged you are, O Israel. Who is like you, a people rescued by Yahweh? The shield of your help, the sword of your triumph. Your enemies shall come fawning to you, and you shall tread upon their backs. And with that, the words of Moses are ended. But you see what's happening in this coda. You've got a teeter-totter. In the first, a seesaw. Well, what else do you call this? We used to call it teeter-totters. Yeah, a teeter-totter. In the first half, he says, wow, what a God like Yahweh. This is amazing. There is none like the God, your God, O Jeshurun, who rides the heavens to your help through the skies. This is my favorite verse to give people who are in stress, because it gives us a picture of God who rides above us, who goes before us, who holds us up from beneath, and He's behind us and He's all around us. This is the God Israel had. Wow, what a God! And underneath are the arms of the Eternal One, and He's the one that takes care of the enemy out there. Congratulations, Israel. No one has a God like you have. What a privilege. But then the other side, and this is that word ashrei. Ashrei. It's usually translated as blessed, or these days trivially, because it's not the only ordinary word for to bless. That's at verse 1 of this chapter. That's the word for to bless. This is a different word. So how blessed doesn't actually work. It leads us in the wrong direction. Ashrei, this is, if the Beatitudes in Scripture of Jesus in Matthew 5, if they were in Hebrew, they would begin with this word. Blessed is the man, Jesus is all these, blessed are the poor in spirit and all the rest of that. And they would begin with Ashrei, and it really is a celebration of the privilege of being the people of God. And Jesus is there announcing it. So here it is. How privileged you are, O Israel, who is like you. And of course, he doesn't then go on to brag about how gifted, how talented, how impressive you all are. No. Their privileges are entirely based on free gift. Gospel. A people rescued by Yahweh. You didn't save yourselves. You can't. Saved by Yahweh, the shield of your help and the sword of your triumph. The enemies will come fawning to you and you will tread on their backs, which is another way of saying the Lord will set you high above the nations for praise, for honor, and glory. And they will look at you and they say, wow, the name of the Lord is written all over them. Praise be to God. And then you have, of course, what's in the triangle, the implication. What is it that this offers? So Israel lives in safety. Jacob lives alone in a land of grain and wine, and whose heavens drop down dew. That's a beautiful picture of Eden. People who have Yahweh as their God are invited to paradise. And of course, now we are introduced to this concept of the covenant triangle that pervades the whole First Testament. This covenant involves Yahweh, the God, at the top, Israel, his people, in the land. This is the triangle. What happened at that ceremony at Mount Gerizim and Ebal in Joshua chapter 8, where Deuteronomy 27 is applied, is that's the moment of the land formally being integrated into the covenant triangle, and then the conquest can begin. Have you ever noticed what happened at Ai? It's a disaster. Why was there a disaster at Ai? The text says because of Achan. When they took Jericho, he claimed some of it. But there's something unsaid here that intrigues me. Moses' second address had ended with, when you cross the river, Jordan River, you shall go by Gilgal and north from Jericho, and then at Sunset Boulevard, you're to turn left and head to Mount Gerizim and Ebal, and there is your first appointment after you've crossed into the Jordan. And that's where, Deuteronomy 27, that parenthetical text, that's where you perform this ceremony of writing on these pillars all the words of this Torah, sacrificing peace offerings and whole burnt offerings like they had at Sinai. It's the final covenant moment when the three parts of the triangle are together for the first time. Remember, at Sinai, God established his relationship with his people. It's only bilateral. On the plains of Moab, under the leadership of Moses, this generation is tied into God. Today you have become the people of Yahweh. That land, we're not there yet. That must wait until we've crossed the river, which is why Moses can't chair that meeting. He's not crossing the Jordan. And it is left to Joshua to finish the work. And once that is done, and I ask myself, how did they land up in Ai? When they left Jericho, they went straight up the hill, straight west to Bethel and Ai, and it was a total disaster. Joshua hadn't been reading the Torah. The Torah says, when you've done with Jericho, up the Jordan River to Sunset Boulevard, turn left, and then head for those mountains, Gerizim and Ebal. And so it was all fixed when they set their sights again now on Gerizim and Ebal, and that's when the official conquest begins. After that, they can go the northern campaign and the southern campaign and all the rest of it, and the Lord delivers everything into their hands. That was a very significant moment. This is the covenant triangle at work. When God's relationship to his people is healthy, the people will take care of the land and it will be healthy, and the land will give praise to the God in heaven who sends the rain, and the whole thing is working magnificently. Paradise, shalom. This is Ezekiel's picture in chapter 34. Everything is in order. Finally, we have reached Eden with this definition of the promised land. The covenant that Moses has renewed with his generation on the plains of Moab is finally completed when they get to Gerizim and Ebal. And then they're home in the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's interesting that when you look at the book of Joshua and you plot it according to how much space is devoted to the topic, the book of Joshua is not actually about the conquest. Have you ever noticed that? Technically, there are 2 or 3 chapters. Chapters 9, 10, 11, 12. That's 4. And then there's a list of kings that they conquered. That's all. What's the rest of the book? Boring. It's all about allotments of land. That's the point. That's the point. Not one good promise of the Lord failed. Everything is completed under Joshua. But we got so bogged down with what happened in Jericho and all the rest of it. We don't forget. The point is, we're home. Finally. No wonder Moses is sad. If they had entered from Kadesh Barnea, he'd have been in his home for 40 years already, enjoying the fruits of the land. I'd have been sour too. It's your fault. But of course, it is not entirely their fault. It's his fault because he blew it. And he did not respect the one who had called him to this high and holy task. But it is a magnificent book. It ends on such a wonderful note. Memorize that exordium at the front and the coda at the back. Memorize those texts because it gives us a picture of where we are in Christ. Congratulations, O people here at the Canadian Baptist Theological Seminary. How privileged you are to have Yahweh incarnate in Jesus as your Savior. What a privilege. What a grace. I thank you.
Hi, Dr. Block, from the back row here.
Yes.
One question I think probably a lot of people would be interested in is, you've given us such a great framework for the big picture of Deuteronomy, and now we can share with our churches how it's a blessing, and I think that's a message a lot of people need to hear. So with this big picture in mind, would you have any guidelines or thoughts briefly then so then how do we get into the weeds? So I'm sure everyone here is excited to read Deuteronomy now.
Yes.
And so with these big picture thoughts in mind, once we start getting into a lot of the details and I won't say laws throughout, once we start getting into some of those guidelines for living that are maybe a bit hard to make sense of today, how can people learn to appreciate and learn from those?
That's a great question. And of course, the standard answer is the first thing to understand all the laws is you divide them into their categories: civil, ceremonial, and moral. Except if you've read Chris Wright, you know that doesn't work. It doesn't. Those are handy, but the boundaries between them are so indistinct. In fact, if you want to categorize them, we should categorize them in other kinds of categories, such as vertical, your life with God in a vertical relationship, your life internally. The Decalogue ends with 2 commands that are about coveting. Watch out that your heart doesn't get all twisted out of shape and you think wrong thoughts about everything else. So keep your... then we talk about family life, community life, the world in the picture that is here. Those kinds of categories are much more helpful. But when we get to the laws specifically, and again, I have the wrong translation. If I had brought my the second volume of my commentary with me, I only have volume 1 here, I would know where it is. But you know the one. When you build a parapet, Or when you build a house, be sure you build a parapet around the house, around the roof of the house. You know that one. What's that got to do with us? I spent 7 years going through Deuteronomy with the students in our church, the Veritas class, and we had about 100 people every Sunday morning from 9:30 to 10:30 in Deuteronomy. It took us 8 years to get through Deuteronomy, line by line, and we did with it what people often do with Romans and Galatians. They'd never heard of that. And we get to verses like this, and I kept reminding the people that we dare not, or we should not be asking the question, do I as a Christian have to keep this law? That's the wrong question. That's what teenagers ask their parents when their parents ask, do I have to? The answer is, no, you don't have to. You get to. You know this. So our question should always be, how is this law my law as I live as one branded by the name of Christ? When you build a parapet around the house. Now, here in this part of the world, there are very few flat roofs. Our warehouses have them, but that takes special engineering to keep the water off there. But in our world, building a house with a roof and then putting a fence guardrail around it is stupid. And if you put it up, you would take it down as soon as the roofers are done. You might put it up there to protect your roofers. But it makes no sense. But we have to realize that this is not a law on architecture. What is the point? Do I have to keep this law? That's the wrong question. How should I keep this law? And the principle of that one is very, very easy because the text says, you as the head of the household are responsible for the well-being of anybody who comes into your house, that you not bring blood guilt upon yourself. It's something like that. No, that is not a civil law. Everything is moral and everything is spiritual. This is an ordinance, an illustration of what covenant love looks like. So that you're always looking out for the next person. They're addressed to the heads of the household. And so if you're building a house, and those of you who have been to the Mediterranean, to Greece, or to the Israel, you know that many of the buildings have flat roofs to this day. In fact, people live up there. It's their family room, the man cave, whatever else. It's where you relax in the evening when the breezes are blowing and where you entertain your guests. We were at the Greek Bible College just outside of Athens. We've been there to teach 3 times. What a blessed place that is. But in one of their dormitories, they got a flat roof. And up there, they've got racks for hanging your laundry and ping pong table and all the rest. Ping pong table up on the roof? But guess what else they have? They have a guardrail. That's living space. It makes perfect sense. I don't have to keep this law, but if I'm concerned about the well-being of my guests, it's what I will naturally do. Most of these laws, the application or the principle underlying it, here's where Chris Wright's work on the ethics of the Old Testament is probably better than anybody else's. But in any case, we need always to be asking, not do Christians have to keep this law, but what is it about this law for Israel's context that is universally transferable? Lots of things are culturally defined. They use the language of that world, but the principle applies here. In Chicago, it means that in the wintertime, when we've had a snowstorm of 26 inches, I shovel my driveway. But what else do I do? I shovel the sidewalk in front of my house. Automatically, without thinking. It's not my property, but these are my neighbors. And we're looking out for each other. And there's so many things about, all the emphasis on the handicapped. Our eyes have been blinded to the righteousness of the Torah that looks out for the well-being of the fatherless and the widow and the orphans and the handicapped. It's what we do. It's who we are. And we don't make political deals out of it. It's not a political issue. It's a righteousness issue. It's an embodiment of grace issue. It changes everything. It changes everything. So, no, this is a great challenge, and it leads to magnificent conversation. When you're dealing with a population that's never heard this perspective before, and you finally begin to take seriously the issues that are involved in these picky little laws. No, this is for life in ancient Israel, illustrating a worldview that is universally applicable. That's our challenge, to figure that one out. And it's a lot easier than we expect in a lot of instances. So anyhow, a long answer to a short question.